I'll start with the question, is bogus self-employment cheating? The answer to that is yes.
People are terrified. You spend your life complaining about journalists, some of you at least, and you think that journalists are competent and competent. They are as weak and as vulnerable as any other section of workers. And for the majority of people working in a newspaper or in a radio station or a television station who are offered a contract, it is not an offer. It is the equivalent of a pint or a transfer guard. That's what it is. There's no choice involved. And if you don't sign the contract, you don't have a job.
Site in Tala, I won't mention the builder, we managed to get 2 positions for 2 young lads, one 20, one 18, as apprentice plasterers with the subcontractor on the site. He treated them abominably, he didn't register them with Sulis, and they were being paid €50 per day, supposedly after tax. We referred it into the WRC, where 2 awards were made amounting to around 8,500 between the 2 workers. Now that's on a procured site, where everything has to be right. They're signing a contract from the OGP. There's a section, a clause in it that says sectoral employment orders will be adhered to. They sign a declaration on every interim payment that rates of pay have been paid, that pension contributions have been paid, that a debt and service benefit is in place, and sick pay as is necessary under the SEOs is in place. None of it was in place. So there are no checks and balances. There's an actual culture there where there is no checks and balances. We've recently had 2 meetings with 2 city councils where we identified on the outsourcing of voids, their empty houses from the council being put out to contractors. So there's a framework and there's a number of contractors on it, and they sign Model Form 15 under the short-term or term refurbishment contract from the OGP, and they're supposed to do a number of things, pay pension contributions, comply with the SEO, comply with all employment law, which includes holidays, redundancy, unfair dismissals, whether they get a statement of the main terms and conditions of employment. So what we discovered was, on one of these sites, one of the contractors had got the job. He then subcontracted it out to another contractor who got the job off him, who in turn subcontracted it out to another contractor who got the job. Now, when we paid the visit, and the visit was made yesterday morning for the 2nd time, we discovered that the contractor who was actually doing the job has 2 people working for him who are both self-employed, who work from 8 to half 4 and are paid a predetermined wage every day. Now, there's no entrepreneurial skill in that. You can't introduce better management structures to make more money. You can't subcontract the job yourself to make more money. So that's what's happening on procured sites. And there are no checks and balances on procured sites. Nowhere. It's just non-existent. It doesn't happen.
It's not an accident that we have an abuse of bogus self-employment, but rather that it is part of a wider approach by employers.
What I would make is, if you are a worker on a building site, or indeed in any other place of employment where this is, in a sense, widespread practice, people have asked in their questions, well, what are the experiences? And my colleagues will answer on that. But this word fear is quite strong. So if you're a worker on a building site, and even if you know you have been misclassified fairly early in the process, and you turn around and you say to the employer, why did you do that? Because I'm a worker. I'm filling all the control mechanisms and everything else. I'm a worker. Well, the answer that you likely get is, if you don't like it, go somewhere else and take a job. So that's the choice, that's the option that a worker has in reality on the ground. Now, the CSO Labour Force Employment Series shows the numbers of employees and the numbers of self-employed people across a range of employment sectors. In particular, the number of self-employed people without any employees is detailed. For example, in Q2 of 2018, the percentage of people classified as self-employed with no employees in construction was 24.3%, while in transportation and storage it was 14.8%, and this compares with 3.9% for industry in general. And so you're looking at a 240 million in one sector possible loss to the state in both PRSI and tax. This is not just a PRSI problem. This is a tax issue as well. Okay. I will take that then and say to you that without, and one of the senators urged us to be stark and straightforward, by any standard, looking at that is potential huge loss to the state in money. And that's a fact in my...
It is a growing area. It is not linked to the low-cost carriers. It is a significant issue in the low-cost carriers. There's no doubt about that across the board. Ryanair are not unique in this area. But it is also there with some of the legacy airlines. And it will increase when the legacy airlines start to having to compete on certain routes, and the costs that they're paying and incurring are significantly more than those who have these bogus self-employment contracts. So there's only one way this is going. And, you know, any analogies of airlines and going up, you know, are just by coincidence, but that's where it's going. In a study done by Ghent University in Belgium in 2015, 1 in 6 pilots across Europe are now on bogus self-employment contracts. That information was backed up by the London School of Economics research done in 2016. So when you're looking at that trend, it's very easy to see that those airlines who have direct employment, and we would describe as responsible airlines who are fulfilling their obligations, both PRSI, tax, compliance with employment law, if this is not changed, they're going to have to compete in that area. And we'll see a continuing growth of this area, this particular development that we're seeing in low-cost airlines. This will creep into some of the larger airlines, into those that do have good agreements with trade unions, that do negotiate, because they're going to be saying to us quite legitimately, what are you doing about that? And if we're seen to be doing nothing, they're going to say, well, we're now competing in that field. So therefore, we're going to have to go down a similar road. The Irish Airline Pilots Association, IALPA, made an extremely detailed presentation to the department back in 2013. And it's particularly focused on one particular airline in relation to Ryanair. But it demonstrated the extent to which people or these organisations were willing to go to create these bogus self-employments. So if I just give you an example of how far they're willing to take this to avoid detection of people being seen as direct employees. And I think it's important to state that in all these cases where people are on these bogus self-employment contracts, they're absolutely 100% under the control of the airline. They absolutely determine what routes they fly, when they're available. They'll, you know, there's obligations with regard to the maximum number of flying hours a pilot can do per annum, which is 900. You'll have somebody like Ryanair will recruit somebody in April, absolutely max them out during the peak period. So when that person then is let go, their flying hours are used up and they can't gain other employment. So that's open to them to do that. That gives them a significant competitive advantage over the competitors to be able to do those type of things. But just if you focus on some of the extent that they're willing to go, in the case of the Ryanair one, they'll actually use a UK contract as a hiring agency. And they've two, I'll avoid going into the names, they were mentioned in the department back in 2013, but they've two particular companies that they use to do this. They're based in the UK and they're not regulated by aviation authorities, neither of them. The pilots are then part of a limited company. So they set the pilots up in a limited company and they have an accountant who acts as the financial director. And you may have 2 or 3 pilots actually in this limited company. Ryanair is not party to the contract. The pilot provides services directly and exclusively to Ryanair, totally and absolutely under their control. And when the nature of the contract is that when they decide they dispense with your service or the contract comes to an end, you have no recourse to any employment legislation, no protections whatsoever.
There was, over the last 10 years, a growth in personal service companies and managed service companies. And there are a number of companies whose business model is establishing those type of processes. And we found it really interesting. And there's thousands of those companies. And a lot of people are absolutely perfectly happy to be in that. They've gone into a director position. But I must say, I was, when we started looking at the contractors, I was fascinated by some of the managed service companies where you have generally 6 directors. Often the 6 directors do not know each other and might be different, they tend to be professionals. And essentially it's a different way of providing that model. The other issue is the whole gig economy model. You will be aware that recently we had an appeal commissioner's decision in relation to an employment of, in relation to, and it's published around delivery, where we challenged the employment status, and that we were successful in that. But the reality is, Deputy, that in a lot of those areas, the contractual arrangements are such that unless either party of the contract decides to tell us that it is not a viable, it's not a legitimate contract, we cannot generally be able to overthrow it.
Well, sure, just to finish with one specific area then, which is the area of couriers, because I understand that there was a meeting back in, I think it was 1997, with representatives of the courier industry who were seeking to have couriers in general classified as self-employed as opposed to employees. And so that was a case where you weren't just waiting for someone to present themselves, but in fact had pre-discussion with the industry, let's say, rather than employers, if you want.
I suppose the real challenge is that the nature of what that bogus self-employment is now mostly done through different corporate structures. The personal service companies, the managed service companies, and the idea, we do not have look-through provisions to look through a limited company. And
now, where would you be going with 54 labour inspectors and the investigation unit and the small number of people that are directly employed in the scope section to counter that? So, why wouldn't there be a development of a view that you can actually do this and nobody will deal with it? So, we talked about the paper system and we talked about the online system. But actually what happens is a contractor now goes online, fills in all the details, designates people, classifies workers as self-employed, and nobody questions it. And one of the reasons is very clearly highlighted in the CNAG report, because the revenue commissioners do not view themselves as having any role in querying or questioning any of that. They are mere collectors of the money into a fund, and they pass it on to the Department of Social Protection, but they have no role, they view, in terms of either querying, questioning, seeing if there are any, and they do have apparently some phone calls every now and then happen between the revenue and social protection if there are trends, apparently. Now that's what they do, that's how the system operates. So we felt that when the paper system was there, people were going through these papers and maybe something would be picked up, but actually it's not any stronger than that. The wholly all of it is that revenue have no function, and they don't. I went and I met the chairman of the revenue commissioners, very nice man, talked to us and so on, but was very clear about what their functions were. Their functions are not to be doing, they collect it, and they do it sort of as, we do it because it makes it life easier for the state to collect the money in that way, but it ain't our job now to be going after, questioning or querying any of that, and that's in the case of PRSI.
How can revenue justify saying that for the purpose of, in the interest of uniformity, that you, as a baseline point, treat them all as self-employed, as opposed to investigating each particular set of circumstances? Thanks. The idea of, in the interest of uniformity, treating them all as self-employed, where does that come from? How can that be justified? As I understand it, there's no such thing as test cases, in the sense that every case has to be looked at individually because the circumstances are individual.
See, in a way, ultimately, the Department of Social Protection have the lead role in relation to setting out the employment status, and scope section will look at it. Social welfare officers determined originally the status. We try as much as possible to have a shared common view between ourselves and DSP. Not all the time, but by and large, because again, the social insurance becomes a driver. We're an agent for DSP and the collection of PRSI.
So there is a dysfunctionality, would be our judgment, in relation to, but doesn't it suit those who utilise it to have that dysfunctionality? And hasn't all this is roaming around the system and operating based on that dysfunctionality because, hey, nobody is going to stop us. We're going to get away, we're going to be able to do this, and so on.
I'm aware in this House, people who operate the communications, the cameras in this place are currently engaged in scoping exercises as well. So, you know, it's in here, it's in this institute, and that's how extensive the problem actually is. Just in relation to the figure of conservative figure of 240 million that Patricia outlined there in terms of the frauding of tax and PRSI in the construction sector, and that's just in one sector, and I assume that's on an annual basis. And you know, it wouldn't take an Einstein to do the maths. If you were to multiply that across all of the sectors, we're possibly dealing with a figure, a fraud, an annual fraud of in excess of €1 billion, being a conservative figure. You know, €1 billion being frauded of this state in terms of tax and PRSI.
It's been said that this practice really amounts to illegal state aid, because what you're doing is querying the pitch competition-wise. You know, you're allowing some rogue employers to take all of the benefits of this as they would see it, and to lead to an imbalance in terms of competition in the sector. I mean, some employers, and Billy Wall and others know this, there are some good construction employers who will engage in sector employment orders and so on, and want to retain and recruit quality staff, provide them with the legal, you know, basic requirements of the job, but there are others that won't. So it could be argued that the growing tolerance for bogus self-employment amounts to something akin to illegal state aid.
I'll move on then and draw that into the question that was asked about public procurement. I'm very glad that question was asked, because it's something that I have tried to raise on numerous occasions, and certainly in certain quarters people either look at me as if you've lost the plot or you don't understand what you're saying. And I'll give you this example. In a public procurement situation, let's stick with the construction industry. And there's a big public, and there's going to be in the 2040, we're told, lots of public money spent, taxpayers' money spent, building roads, building hospitals, building schools, doing all that. So it's essential we get this right. So if you take that situation where there's a public procurement for a big project and a real donkey load of taxpayers' money going to go into this project, I have asked the question, what is to stop the following scenario? And the following scenario is that a contractor goes in and tenders for the job, big job, tenders for the job on the basis of the following. All the workers will be directly employed. All the workers will be paid the sectoral employment order, which is the rate for the job through the House of the Oireachtas. And the quantity surveyors, or the people who put all these figures together, put in the price to the state for doing the job, with everybody being directly employed and everybody receiving the rate. Okay? That's the cost to the state. And that's what the state would want to see happening. Now, the job happens, the contractor gets the job, goes onto the pitch and starts to do the work on the site. Big job, big public procurement money. I would have a big question mark over. Are all the jobs direct? And are all the jobs paying the SEO? Because if they're not, the state has committed to pay this price for the contract to be concluded. That contractor is going to get all that money. What's the difference now? Where does the money go when you start putting employees, they're no longer employees and you're not paying the PRSI? You've charged the state for it. You've charged the state for it. And you've charged the state for paying everybody the proper rate. I know of nothing that happens for anyone to go out and check to see if that the case. Big money loss in my judgment, or potential money loss there if there is no monitoring of that. Very few people.
Bogus self-employment. I mean, I'm very clear on this. I mean, the practice of bogus self-employment amounts to nothing short of fraud. It's a fraud on the state, it's a fraud on the taxpayer, and in my clear opinion, it is a matter of corruption on a mass scale. The state can have all the inspection regimes or investigation systems and deterrence as it sees it in place that it wants, but the numbers engaged in bogus self-employment are growing.
Issue of the contract, drawing in the contractors to pay more money, but actually at the moment the manner in which the propositions are coming from the government, and indeed decisions have been made in relation to self-employed, has now got severe implications for the Social Insurance Fund in its very right, because they're now saying if you're self-employed, you pay 4%. That fund is under huge, huge pressure, 70% of which goes out in terms of state pensions to people who've reached their retirement. And the most recent audit or actuarial review of it says it could be in severe difficulty by 2035 financially. Well, why wouldn't it be if you say to one group, you can have all the benefits for 4%, and the rest of us can only be in it if we have an employer to match us with the 10.9% and our 4%. So there are big issues all around. There was a suggestion by the tax strategy group of the Department of Finance when they, in 2017, and they made a recommendation that the contributions from self-employed should be proportionate with the benefits that they would get, and they estimated that proportion to be 12% of a contribution. That was their estimate, that it would be 12%. Now, clearly, if there was a decision made to have a proportionate contribution into the Social Welfare Fund from self-employed people, I'm slowly doing away with my chances of going home anyway, peacefully. But anyway, if there is a chance to get people in self-employed at 12%, and that's regarded as the proportion, then what you would see, the economic incentive would lower greatly for employers because everybody would have to pay this 12%. So these bogusly self-employed, misclassified people, instead of paying 4%, actually they'd be paying 12%.
You asked, is there a fraud? Yes, there is a fraud, but I would also say there is a conspiracy, and there is a conspiracy of silence by the state, and has allowed this to happen. And to sort of shrug their shoulders, revisit it about every 10 or 15 years and say nothing to see here.